My father stood in the courtroom, smirking as he legally stripped away my only home. He whispered that I would be left with $0 to my name, but his arrogant smile vanished the second the powerful judge took off his glasses. The judge's eyes filled with tears. He was not looking at a worthless, soon-to-be homeless daughter. He was looking at the person who pulled his only son from the jaws of death exactly 6 years ago. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories. We want to thank you sincerely for your continuous support. Unfortunately, our channel has been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay for their daily living expenses and continue creating these dramatic stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. My name is Brielle Duncan, and I am 32 years old. The air inside the downtown Seattle courtroom felt incredibly heavy, carrying the stale scent of polished mahogany and the bitter reality of betrayal. It was a suffocating, sterile coldness that clung to my skin, mirroring the absolute ruthlessness of the people sitting only a few feet away from me. This was not a trial between strangers. This was a calculated execution of family ties. At the plaintiff's table sat Arthur Duncan, a notorious commercial real estate tycoon, and unfortunately, my biological father. He was immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating the terrifying arrogance of a man who believed the world existed solely for him to conquer. He had dragged me into this courtroom to legally evict me, his own flesh and blood, from my small coastal home. Arthur stood up, projecting his deep, commanding voice so that it echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. He confidently declared to the judge that I was nothing more than a pathetic freeloader. He twisted the narrative effortlessly, painting himself as a long-suffering patriarch who had finally run out of patience. He boldly stated that he had obtained the legal ownership rights to my coastal property, and that it was his absolute right to bulldoze my quiet sanctuary to the ground. His grand plan was to pave over my home and replace it with a massive, soulless luxury resort project. I stood at the defendant's table, my hands clasped tightly together. As Arthur's high-priced lawyer stepped forward to submit the emergency eviction order to the bailiff, Arthur turned his head slightly in my direction. The smugness on his face was nauseating. He leaned in just enough, lowering his voice into a venomous whisper, yet making sure it was loud enough for the entire first row of spectators to hear every single word. "Enjoy being homeless," Arthur sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "I made sure you do not have a single penny left to your name." Beside him sat Vance, my older brother. Vance had always been the golden child, the favored son who was handed everything on a silver platter. He currently held the powerful position of chief executive officer within our family corporation. Hearing our father's cruel threat, Vance let out a quiet scoff. He leaned over and gave Arthur a congratulatory pat on the shoulder, looking at me with pure, undisguised contempt. They were celebrating my destruction right in front of my eyes. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stood there in absolute silence, forcing myself to take slow, measured breaths. I locked my knees to keep my legs from shaking, aggressively suppressing the burning rage and profound sorrow swirling in my chest. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Presiding over this nightmare was Judge Harrison. He was a legendary figure in the Seattle legal district, an older man famous for his unyielding principles, zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, and a demeanor as cold as steel. He took the heavy folder containing the emergency eviction order from the bailiff. The entire room fell quiet, waiting for the inevitable scratch of his pen that would finalize my ruin. Judge Harrison flipped through the thick stack of legal documents. His expression was completely unreadable as his eyes scanned the dense paragraphs. He reached for his heavy fountain pen, ready to approve Arthur's request. But then, his gaze stopped. His eyes locked onto a specific section near the bottom of the page, the section that listed my full legal name and my current professional occupation. The heavy silence in the courtroom stretched out, becoming tighter and more agonizing with every passing second. Judge Harrison did not sign the paper. The pen hovered uselessly in the air. Arthur shifted his weight in his chair, clearly annoyed by the unexpected delay. Slowly, Judge Harrison set his pen down. He took off his reading glasses. He stood up from his high leather chair, his authoritative presence dominating the room. But as he gripped the edges of the case file, his hands began to visibly tremble. He looked up, bypassing the expensive lawyers and my arrogant father, his eyes fixing entirely on me. When he finally opened his mouth, the fierce, cold magistrate was gone. Instead, he asked a single question that had absolutely nothing to do with the eviction case. A question so incredibly unexpected that it left the entire courtroom sitting in stunned, breathless bewilderment. To understand how my father and brother could sit comfortably in that courtroom plotting my absolute ruin, you have to understand the fundamental crack in the Duncan family foundation. I was the anomaly. In a family that worshipped profit margins, hostile takeovers, and the crushing of competitors, I was considered a genetic defect. Arthur viewed empathy as a terminal weakness. From the time I was a young child, he made it abundantly clear that the family business required apex predators, not peacekeepers. My brother Vance absorbed this toxic lesson perfectly. He was molded from clay to be the ruthless heir, his path paved with golden opportunities, limitless trust funds, and blind praise. I tried to earn my father's respect through my own merits. When I graduated at the very top of my university class with a dual degree at 22 years old, Arthur did not even bother to attend the ceremony. He was too busy flying out to Tokyo to finalize a corporate merger. Whenever I brought home a prestigious academic award or a championship sports trophy, he would briefly glance at it before redirecting the conversation entirely to Vance. Arthur poured tens of millions of dollars into Vance's flashy, ill-conceived tech startups and luxury development proposals. He would stand at high society gala dinners, his chest puffed out with pride, loudly bragging about my brother's aggressive business tactics to anyone who would listen. I was simply the background scenery in their grand portrait of success. The message was explicitly clear. If I refused to be a shark in his corporate ocean, I was entirely invisible to him. The only genuine warmth I ever knew within our bloodline came from my Aunt Clara, my father's older sister. Clara was everything Arthur was not. She was gentle, deeply grounded, and possessed a spirit that preferred the quiet rhythm of the ocean over the chaotic noise of a corporate boardroom. She owned a modest, weathered cedar house right on the rugged coastline. It was my only sanctuary. Whenever the emotional frostbite of my father's mansion became too much to bear, I would flee to Clara. We would sit on her porch for hours, listening to the crashing waves. Before she fell seriously ill, she held my hands tight and made a solemn verbal promise. She told me, with absolute certainty, that the coastal house would always be mine. She promised it would be a safe harbor where I would never have to worry about being cast out into the cold. It was a promise made from pure love, not a legally ironclad contract, which ultimately proved to be a fatal vulnerability. Knowing I could never survive the toxic environment of the Duncan Empire, I made a drastic choice. I completely severed my financial ties with Arthur. I rejected the trust funds, the platinum credit cards, and the suffocating expectations. Instead, I sought a life that held undeniable, tangible value. I endured grueling physical testing and enlisted in the Oceanic Apex Rescue Division. This was not your standard, everyday coastal patrol unit. It was an elite, highly specialized rescue force deployed strictly in the most lethal maritime environments on the planet. My daily reality shifted dramatically from velvet-lined dining rooms to the deafening roar of military-grade helicopter rotors. My job was to strap myself into a heavy harness and rappel down from a hovering aircraft directly into the heart of massive, swirling storm systems. We operated in near-zero visibility conditions, diving into freezing, 40-foot waves to extract drowning victims from capsized fishing vessels or sinking wreckage. It was a profession that demanded absolute physical endurance, an unbreakable mental fortitude, and the quiet, sobering acceptance that any given day on the job could easily be my last. We worked exhausting 70-hour weeks, putting our lives on the line for complete strangers. I found my true worth suspended on a thin steel cable between a raging black sky and a deadly, violent ocean. To my family, however, my life-saving career was nothing but a humiliating joke. They completely ignored the lives I helped save. During the rare, forced holiday family gatherings I reluctantly attended, Arthur would deliberately go out of his way to humiliate me. He would stand in the center of the room before our wealthy relatives, holding a crystal glass of incredibly expensive scotch, and loudly announce that I was a complete and utter failure. "She threw away a multi-million-dollar corporate empire to play lifeguard," he would say, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. "She risks her neck working 24 hours a day for absolute pennies as a glorified Coast Guard, just to rebel against me. It is pathetic." He viewed my dedication as a personal insult, a rebellion against his absolute authority. He could not comprehend why anyone would choose to save lives when they could be making millions of dollars instead. And because he could not control me with money, he decided to punish me with cruelty, setting the stage for the ultimate betrayal that brought us all into that sterile courtroom. Exactly 6 years ago, the true test of my life occurred far away from any sterile corporate boardroom. It was the middle of November. A massive Category 4 hurricane had unexpectedly stalled over the remote northern coastline, a treacherous stretch of water local fishermen chillingly referred to as Blood Bay. The sky was not just dark, it was a bruised, violently churning black canvas that completely swallowed the horizon. Our radio crackled with a frantic emergency distress signal. A small, independent oceanographic research vessel had been caught dead in the center of the swelling chaos. They were taking on water incredibly fast, completely helpless against the monstrous 40-foot swells. The wind was screaming at over 130 miles per hour, turning the driving rain into horizontal sheets of icy shrapnel. Inside the belly of our rescue helicopter, the noise was absolutely deafening. The entire aircraft shook violently as our pilot fought desperately to keep us steady above the designated coordinates. When we finally spotted the wreckage through the blinding storm, my stomach completely dropped. The research vessel was entirely capsized, its rusted metal hull barely breaching the surface of the violently frothing ocean. It was surrounded by a deadly debris field of shattered fiberglass, torn fishing nets, and jagged metal plating. The storm was simply too violent to follow standard operating procedures. Our pilot yelled over the communications system that lowering the hoist cable down to the surface was suicidal. The hurricane-force winds would whip the heavy steel line around, potentially wrapping it around the ship's exposed propellers or slicing right through our team. We could not lower safely. There was only one way to reach whatever was left of the trapped crew. I looked down at the freezing, furious ocean below. I did not hesitate for a single second. I unclipped my primary safety tether, took a deep breath, and threw my body out of the open helicopter door. The freefall felt like a terrifying eternity before I slammed violently into the freezing water. The shock of the cold instantly stole the breath from my lungs. The water temperature was hovering just a few degrees above freezing. I fought my way through the dark, murky waves, aggressively pushing aside sharp, broken planks of wood that threatened to slice right through my thermal suit. The overwhelming smell of raw diesel fuel and salt water burned my nose and throat. I reached the submerged deck of the capsized vessel and found a shattered glass window leading into the main cabin. I squeezed my shoulders through the narrow, jagged opening. Inside, it was a terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare. The cabin was completely upside down and rapidly filling with dark, churning water. In the very back, illuminated only by the faint, strobing beam of my helmet light, I found him. He was a young man, perhaps barely in his early 20s. He was trapped deep in the corner of the sinking room. A massive steel laboratory centrifuge had broken off its heavy mounting bolts and completely pinned his right leg against the ceiling, which was now acting as the floor. The freezing water had already risen past his chest and was slowly creeping up to his neck. His face was entirely devoid of color, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. Severe hypothermia had already taken hold of his fragile body. His eyes were half closed, the life rapidly draining out of him. He was shivering so violently that he could not even speak. He had given up on surviving. "Look at me!" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the echoing metal walls. "Keep your eyes open. I am getting you out of here right now." He barely registered my presence, offering only a weak, gurgling whisper that I could not hear over the terrifying groaning sounds of the sinking ship's metal hull. I knew we had less than 2 minutes before the vessel went down permanently. I took a massive gulp of the limited foul air left in the cabin and submerged myself entirely into the pitch-black, freezing water. Underwater, I could not see a single thing. I had to rely entirely on touch. I ran my heavy gloves down his freezing leg until I felt the solid steel machinery crushing his shin. It was incredibly heavy, weighing at least 300 pounds. My lungs immediately began to burn, screaming aggressively for oxygen. I firmly braced my heavy boots against the bulkhead, grabbed the sharp edge of the machinery, and pulled backward with every single ounce of strength my body possessed. I thought my muscles would completely tear apart. The water pressure was immense, pushing heavily against me, fighting my rescue attempt. I refused to let him die in this dark, watery tomb. With a final agonizing surge of adrenaline, I shifted the heavy steel block just enough. I felt his leg slip free. I grabbed his bright orange life vest and kicked violently toward the surface of the flooded cabin. We broke the surface just as the ship let out a deafening structural shriek. The trapped air bubble we were breathing was completely collapsing. The vessel was rapidly going down to the dark bottom of the ocean. I wrapped my arms tightly around his chest and dragged him backward through the shattered window just as the entire cabin flooded completely. We burst out into the raging ocean storm. The helicopter was hovering dangerously low above us, finally dropping the heavy steel rescue basket into the waves, now that we were physically clear of the sinking wreckage. I quickly strapped the unconscious young man into the basket and aggressively signaled the winch operator to pull us up. But the ocean was not done fighting us. As the steel cable began to lift us heavily into the air, a sudden, massive gust of cyclonic wind slammed directly into the side of the helicopter. The cable violently swung out like a terrifying, uncontrollable pendulum. We were hurled directly toward the towering, jagged black rocks of the coastal cliffside. I saw the razor-sharp stone approaching at a terrifying speed. The young man was completely exposed to the impact. In a fraction of a second, I violently twisted my body around, aggressively wrapping my limbs around his torso, intentionally turning my own back toward the cliff face to act as a human shield. The physical impact was absolutely brutal. The sharp edges of the cliff rock tore directly through my reinforced, heavy-duty suit and sliced deeply into my flesh. A blinding, white-hot agony exploded across my entire back, threatening to make me pass out. But I absolutely did not let go of the young man. I held on to him even tighter, clenching my jaw until my teeth nearly cracked, until the cable finally pulled us clear of the rocks and safely dragged us into the roaring, metallic belly of the helicopter. Blood heavily soaked the metal floor of the aircraft, but the emergency medical team immediately went to work on the severely hypothermic boy. As soon as we violently touched down at the emergency coastal triage center, I helped unload his dripping stretcher. The paramedics rushed him away, his heart still weakly beating solely because we categorically refused to quit. The local news crews were already swarming the landing pad like vultures, desperate for an exclusive television interview, shouting loud questions and aggressively shoving heavy camera lenses in my direction. I completely ignored all of them. I let the medical staff painfully stitch the massive, gaping wound on my back, and then I simply walked away into the rain. I firmly refused to give them my name. I refused to step in front of any camera to claim the temporary glory. I sat alone in a quiet, dimly lit room, filed a standard, mandatory rescue operation report, and silently prepared my mind and body for the next inevitable disaster call. The roaring memory of the hurricane, the freezing salt water, and the deafening crash of the ocean faded away, instantly replaced by the suffocating, pin-drop silence of the downtown Seattle courtroom. We were violently pulled back into the present reality. I was still standing perfectly still at the defendant's table, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs, right beneath the thick, raised scar that stretched across my entire back. Judge Harrison was still standing behind his elevated wooden bench, staring down at my file. But then, he did something that completely shattered the rigid protocol of the legal system. He did not call the bailiff. He did not bang his wooden gavel to announce a verdict. Instead, he slowly walked out from behind his massive oak desk. Every single pair of eyes in the gallery followed his uncharacteristic movement. The expensive corporate lawyers sitting next to my father froze in absolute confusion. Judge Harrison descended the 3 wooden steps and walked directly across the polished floor toward my table. The fierce, intimidating magistrate was entirely gone. As he stopped just a few feet in front of me, I saw that his hands were trembling violently. His eyes, usually sharp and analytical, were completely flooded with tears. He swallowed hard, fighting desperately to control the raw emotion choking his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper that echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. "Are you the rescue operative who wore badge number 407 on the night of the massive storm exactly 6 years ago?" I looked into his desperately searching eyes. I remembered the standardized rescue report I had silently filed that night, leaving only my division identification number in the designated box because I refused to talk to the press. I took a slow breath, held his gaze, and gave him a single firm nod. "Yes, Your Honor. I am badge number 407. The moment the words left my mouth, the powerful judge completely broke down. He covered his mouth with his trembling hand, a heavy, agonizing sob tearing from his chest. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur of shock, but Judge Harrison ignored the noise completely. He looked directly at me, tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face, utterly abandoning his professional detachment. "That young man trapped in the research vessel," Judge Harrison cried, his voice breaking with overwhelming gratitude. "The boy you pulled from the freezing water and shielded with your own body against those jagged coastal rocks. That was my son. He is my only child. The doctors told me that if you had let go of him for even one single second, he would not have survived the brutal impact. You gave me my entire world back." A collective, stunned gasp swept through the spectator seating. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the room shifted instantly from hostility to profound reverence. But my father, completely devoid of basic human empathy, was utterly blind to the monumental shift in the room's dynamic. Arthur's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure annoyance. To him, this miraculous revelation was nothing more than an inconvenient delay in his multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. Arthur aggressively pushed his chair back and stood up, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking ridiculous against his grotesque lack of humanity. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, clicking his tongue in frustration. "Your Honor, while this is all a very touching coincidence, we have an incredibly tight construction schedule to maintain. I respectfully ask that we return to the matter at hand and finalize the emergency eviction order for the coastal property so my crew can bulldoze that useless shack by tomorrow morning." Judge Harrison whipped his head around to face my father. The vulnerable, crying father vanished, instantly replaced by a terrifying incarnation of judicial wrath. His face flushed a deep, dangerous red. "Shut your mouth, Arthur!" Judge Harrison roared, his voice echoing like thunder against the courtroom walls. "Do not dare to say another word!" Arthur flinched violently, stepping back. His smug, arrogant smile was completely wiped from his face. The aggressive, high-priced lawyers beside him physically shrank back in their luxurious leather chairs. "You have the sheer audacity to stand in my courtroom and demand I throw this incredible woman out onto the street?" Judge Harrison yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at Arthur's chest. "You have a daughter who is an absolute hero, a woman who literally bleeds to save the lives of complete strangers while you sit in your climate-controlled office counting your money. And you use dirty, aggressive legal tricks to rob her of her only home? You absolutely disgust me." Beside Arthur, my brother Vance was suddenly looking incredibly sick. The arrogant smirk had completely melted off his face. I could see thick beads of cold sweat rapidly forming on Vance's forehead. He frantically tugged at the tight collar of his silk shirt, his eyes darting nervously between the furious judge and his own panicked legal team. Vance realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the immense legal advantage the Duncan Corporation walked in with had just completely evaporated into thin air. Judge Harrison turned his back on my father in disgust and marched heavily back up the wooden steps to his bench. He snatched the emergency eviction order from his desk, held it up for everyone to see, and violently ripped it entirely in half, throwing the useless pieces onto the floor. "The eviction order is permanently suspended," Judge Harrison declared, slamming his heavy gavel down with a deafening crack that made my father jump. "In fact, I am completely changing the parameters of this entire hearing. We are no longer treating this as a simple civil property dispute. I am officially ordering a full microscopic investigation into the legal validity of the land transfer documents you just submitted to this court. Arthur, I want my clerks to find out exactly how you obtained the deed to that coastal property." Instead of formally adjourning the morning session to process this massive revelation, Judge Harrison ordered the heavy oak doors of the courtroom to be securely locked. No one was allowed to enter or leave. He fiercely motioned for the chief court auditor and the head legal clerk to approach his elevated bench. He handed them the glossy, notarized property transfer deed my father had so arrogantly submitted as undeniable evidence of his ownership over Aunt Clara's coastal home. Judge Harrison instructed his staff to immediately cross-reference the exact date of the signature on that specific legal document with the official county hospital admission and medical records. The wait was agonizingly tense. The large air conditioning units hummed loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. Arthur paced back and forth near his designated table, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished marble floor. He repeatedly checked his heavy gold wristwatch, loudly complaining to his nervous lawyers about his wasted time, but the subtle, uncontrollable tremor in his hands completely betrayed his rapidly growing panic. Exactly 20 minutes later, the head clerk practically sprinted back into the courtroom and handed Judge Harrison a freshly printed stack of verified medical documents. The judge read the top page. A chilling, dangerous smile slowly spread across his weathered face. He looked up, his eyes locking onto my father like a predator about to strike a trapped animal. "Arthur Duncan," Judge Harrison began, his voice dangerously low and echoing through the silent room. "According to this legally binding transfer deed, your sister, Clara Duncan, signed over the total ownership of her coastal property to your corporate entity on the 14th of October. My father stopped pacing. He cleared his throat loudly, aggressively trying to maintain his arrogant, untouchable facade. "That is absolutely correct, Your Honor. She signed it completely willingly. It was a perfectly standard legal transaction between family members." "That is truly fascinating," Judge Harrison replied, his voice dripping with pure, concentrated venom. "Because I currently hold in my hand the official sworn medical records from Seattle General Hospital. These records prove, unequivocally and without a single shadow of a doubt, that on the 14th of October, Clara Duncan was securely locked inside the intensive care unit. She had suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke exactly 2 days prior and was placed in a medically induced deep coma. She was breathing entirely through a mechanical ventilator and was completely 100% unresponsive. The entire courtroom immediately erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked gasps. I stared directly at my father, a heavy wave of pure, absolute disgust washing over my entire body. He had not just stolen from a dying woman who loved me, he had maliciously forged the legal signature of his own sister while she lay unconscious and dying on her hospital bed. "That is a clear, undeniable case of felony document forgery," Judge Harrison announced loudly, striking his wooden gavel hard to silence the frantic room. And it begs a very serious, deeply troubling question. Why would a man who publicly claims to be a billionaire real estate tycoon risk a severe federal prison sentence just to steal a tiny, weathered cedar house on a small plot of remote coastal land? Judge Harrison absolutely did not wait for my father to formulate another pathetic lie. He immediately ordered the court's Financial Investigation Unit to digitally pull the public tax filings, the corporate credit profiles, and the active loan ledgers of the entire Duncan real estate empire. The powerful legal system aggressively began digging its sharp claws deep into the pristine, fake facade of my father's business. As the clerks quickly analyzed the rapidly incoming data, the terrifying, hidden truth of our family was finally dragged out into the harsh courtroom light. The mighty Duncan empire was completely hollow. It was nothing but a massive, crumbling house of cards, standing on the absolute brink of total financial annihilation. The auditors discovered that over the past 4 years, Vance had made a continuous series of catastrophic, highly aggressive investment decisions in luxury commercial retail spaces right before the market completely crashed. His spectacular failures had accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic, entirely unpayable corporate debt. My father had secretly drained every single corporate account, quietly liquidated their legitimate assets, and mortgaged their own towering office buildings just to cover up Vance's disastrous mistakes and keep their wealthy international investors from finding out the brutal truth. They were completely, desperately out of money. My aunt's untouched coastal land was the very last piece of unencumbered, debt-free real estate legally attached to the family name. Arthur absolutely needed to violently evict me and take total possession of that land so he could use it as collateral to secure a desperate $50 million emergency loan from an overseas bank. If he did not get that land today, his entire corporate empire would officially default on its massive loans by the end of the business week. As the chief auditor read these catastrophic financial findings aloud into the permanent court record, I watched my brother Vance physically crumble. The terrifying realization that his immense incompetence was now a matter of public record, and that he was facing decades behind thick iron bars as a direct accomplice to felony forgery, completely broke his fragile, pampered ego. "I did not do it!" Vance suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic terror. He jumped up from his leather chair, violently pushing himself away from our father. He pointed a violently trembling, accusatory finger directly at Arthur's face. "It was all his idea!" Vance shouted, tears of intense panic streaming down his face as he completely abandoned the man who had protected him his entire life. "He forced the private notary to backdate the transfer deed. He hired the fraudulent property appraisers. He told me that if we did not steal Brielle's house, the angry board of directors would throw us both in federal prison for massive corporate embezzlement. I just did exactly what he ordered me to do. I will give you all of his hidden offshore bank account numbers, Your Honor. I will testify to every single dirty deal. Just please, I am begging you, give me a plea deal." Arthur stood frozen in absolute shock, his mouth hanging completely open. The legendary, terrifying business titan was being publicly slaughtered by his own beloved golden child right in the middle of the courtroom. The wealthy spectators in the gallery, the exact same people who had spent decades fearing and respecting my father, now stared at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. The quiet whispers of fear had completely transformed into loud, mocking laughter and murmurs of intense disgust. The impenetrable, terrifying mask of the billionaire tycoon had been violently ripped away, revealing nothing but a desperate, pathetic criminal who had been completely destroyed by the cowardice of his own son. Exactly 6 months after that fateful day in Judge Harrison's courtroom, the absolute destruction of the Duncan real estate empire was finalized. It was not just a quiet corporate restructuring. It was a highly publicized, catastrophic collapse that dominated the front pages of every financial newspaper in the country. The massive corporation officially declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. All of their luxurious development projects across the city were permanently frozen by court order, leaving behind giant, empty steel skeletons rusting in the rain. Every single corporate bank account was heavily audited and completely frozen. The overseas banks violently called in their massive debts, and the local lending institutions mercilessly seized everything. The towering downtown office buildings, the private corporate jets, the sprawling mansions, all of it was violently ripped away from my father. Arthur was no longer the terrifying, untouchable titan of industry. He was facing a severe federal prison sentence for multiple counts of massive financial fraud and the felony forgery of my Aunt Clara's legal documents. He was left with absolutely $0 to his name. The high society elite, the exact same wealthy politicians and arrogant business partners who used to aggressively court his favor and laugh at his cruel jokes, completely turned their backs on him. When he walked into a room, they no longer feared him. They treated him like an infectious disease. He was utterly ruined, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his heavily fabricated reputation. On the brisk, gray morning of his final sentencing hearing, I walked down the long, brightly lit hallway of the federal courthouse. I was not there to testify. I was simply there to witness the final chapter of the nightmare he had subjected me to. As I approached the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom, a frail, trembling figure stepped out from the shadows to block my path. It took me a moment to even recognize him. Arthur looked incredibly old and deeply pathetic. His expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket. His face was deeply lined with profound exhaustion and terror. When he looked at me, his eyes were completely bloodshot and filled with panicked tears. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was completely erased. He practically threw himself toward me, his shaking hands desperately reaching out to grab my arm. But I stepped back smoothly, refusing to let him touch me. "Brielle, please," Arthur begged, his voice cracking into a loud, humiliating sob right in the middle of the crowded public hallway. "Please, you have to help me. The prosecutors are asking the judge to lock me away for 20 years. I will die in a federal prison cell. You know Judge Harrison. You saved his son. He respects you. If you just go in there and speak on my behalf, if you just tell him that we are blood family, that I am your father, I know he will reduce my sentence. Please, Brielle, I am begging you on my knees." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had mercilessly tried to throw me out onto the street and leave me with absolutely nothing. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not want to scream at him or curse his name. The burning rage that had lived inside my chest for my entire life was completely gone, replaced by a profound, unbreakable peace. I looked directly into his terrified, weeping eyes. My voice was perfectly calm and incredibly steady. "You taught me that in this world, you have to rely entirely on yourself," I said softly, letting the absolute weight of the truth wash over him. "I learned that lesson very well. Now, it is your turn." I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back and walked down the long, echoing marble hallway. I did not look back even once, completely ignoring the loud, agonizing wails of a broken man collapsing onto the cold floor in a state of terminal regret and utter, inescapable despair. 2 days later, I stood on the weathered wooden porch of my aunt's beautiful coastal home. The official property deed, fully verified and legally untouchable, was safely locked inside my desk. The morning sun was rising over the vast, shimmering ocean, casting a brilliant golden light across the crashing waves. I breathed in the deep, salty sea air, feeling a sense of absolute, untethered freedom. I was wearing my heavy, dark blue Oceanic Apex Rescue Division uniform. High above, the rhythmic, deafening beat of military-grade helicopter rotors began to echo through the sky. The massive rescue aircraft hovered perfectly above my property, aggressively whipping the tall coastal grass into a frenzy. I smiled, secured my heavy harness, and stepped confidently toward the dropping steel cable, ready to fly directly into the storm and continue living the fierce, brilliantly free life of a hero. Thank you so much to all of our amazing listeners for staying with us until the very end of this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please share your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Your kind support directly pays the salaries of our hardworking team, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better and more exciting stories for you. Thank you, and stay safe.